Chapter 1. A Wedding in Waiting. It was the sort of wedding that made society columnists compose headlines in their sleep. The ceremony was to take place in the gardens of High Weald Manor, an estate whose very name evoked money, old family titles, and the faint scent of roses that had never known the touch of a market gardener's hand. The bride, Miss Charlotte Ferncliff, was a figure of serene elegance, heiress to a textile fortune, the only daughter of the widowed Lady Helena Ferncliff. At 27, she possessed the rare combination of refined breeding and shrewd intelligence that had made her a quietly formidable presence in London's social circles. The groom, Mr. Alexander Draycott, was a solicitor of rising prominence, whose respectable charm and discreet manner made him both admired and envied. The weather, it seemed, had read the invitations. The afternoon was golden, the air warm without heaviness, the sky an unblemished sweep of summer blue. Guests had begun to gather in the long drawing-room before the garden ceremony, champagne flutes in hand, each one turning subtly to take in the others, appraising gowns, noting jewels, measuring rivals. Among the guests were not only the close friends and extended families of the couple, but a smattering of those fixtures of the English countryside, neighbours, old acquaintances, and the sort of people invited for reasons of duty rather than desire. The tone was light, laughter was easy, and yet beneath the tinkling of glass and polite conversation there was the unmistakable vibration of unspoken tensions, the kind that hover in grand houses where large sums of money and larger egos cohabit. Lady Helena moved through the room in her pale lavender silk, smiling graciously at everyone while maintaining that distant, almost regal reserve she had perfected over decades. In her wake trailed Miss Lydia Harcourt, a cousin of the bride and a woman with a smile sharpened like a blade. Lydia's eyes lingered too long on Charlotte's diamond hair comb, too coolly on the groom. At the far end of the room stood Mr. Hugh Kettering, a school friend of the groom's, deep in animated conversation with a younger man who appeared both deferential and slightly ill at ease. Hugh's laughter was too loud, his cufflinks too ostentatious, and there was Mrs. Margaret Draycott, the groom's mother, watchful, dressed in black silk despite the celebratory occasion, as though she were attending a funeral instead of a wedding. It was shortly before 3 o'clock when the murmur of conversation faltered. Someone had just noticed a small, curious disturbance. Charlotte had disappeared. No one worried at first. The bride, after all, had every right to a few moments of solitude before the ceremony. But then came whispers among the bridesmaids. She was not in her room, nor in the bridal antechamber, nor in the library where she had retreated the day before to compose herself. By 3:30, the search was no longer discreet. It was Alexander Draycott himself who found her. In the rose garden, beneath the shade of an ancient yew, Charlotte Ferncliff lay crumpled upon the grass, her bouquet scattered beside her. Her wedding gown was unblemished, save for a strange thing. Woven into her hair, just above her left ear, was a single thorn. A doctor, summoned from among the guests, knelt to examine her. His pronouncement, grave and final, carried across the stunned gathering, "She is dead." A ripple of disbelief passed through the guests, followed by the chaotic shuffle of speculation. No mark of violence was visible save for that thorn, which the doctor withdrew with gloved fingers. Yet the pallor of Charlotte's skin, the slight constriction of her lips, suggested not a fainting fit, but the quiet certainty of life ended. Lady Helena stood rigid, her hands clasped too tightly before her, while Alexander's face was a mask. White, still, unreadable. The local constable arrived, ill-prepared for such a scene among the county's finest. He questioned briefly, moved awkwardly, and took hurried notes in a small dog-eared pad. Within the hour, he was on the telephone to Scotland Yard. The guests were informed they would remain at High Weald until further notice. Champagne flutes were quietly cleared away. The long drawing-room became a holding pen of muffled voices and pale faces. The gossip began immediately. Poison, a weak heart, a tragic accident. But among the guests was one who did not indulge in speculation. A small, dapper man in a perfectly tailored grey suit, with patent leather shoes that gleamed and a moustache of precise elegance, sat quietly in a corner, observing each shifting glance, each whispered word. Hercule Poirot, newly returned from a brief sojourn in France, had accepted an invitation to this wedding only at the insistence of an old friend connected with the Ferncliff family. He had intended to enjoy the day, to indulge in a little genteel people-watching. Now, his eyes rested upon the strange Thorn lying on a folded handkerchief near the doctor's case. It was not, he noted, an ordinary garden thorn. He sat back, steepling his fingers. A wedding, yes, but perhaps also a curtain rising on a far darker performance. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The late afternoon light had shifted subtly, as though the sun itself were reluctant to shine, unfolding in the rose garden. Under his ill-fitting cap hovered the guests, now subdued and strangely formal, remained in. Hercule Poirot stood by the body of Charlotte Ferncliff, and his back, the patent leather of his shoes untouched by the damp grass. Observed what others had overlooked in their shock, the careful arrangement of the bride, the curious fact that her veil had been pinned in place with meticulous precision despite the thorn, now removed, that had been lodged in her hair without disturbing coiffure. The doctor, a sandy-haired man of straightened from his examination. Poison. No trauma. She was healthy as far as I'm aware. It's unusual, but not unprecedented. Ah. Think perhaps that on the day of her marriage, in the very bloom of her of nothing in particular? No, doctor. Such an ending. Untidy. The doctor bristled faintly, but the constables arrived. Name, sir? The man asked. Poirot. I am here only as a guest, yet perhaps you will permit that I. His eyes widened. Poirot. The Poirot? With relief. If you'd be so kind, sir. Truth be told, or our parish. Poirot bent slightly, his gaze sweeping over. The hem showed a faint greenish smear near the left side, pollen or crust. Its hand, a single petal lay on the grass, its edges browned as though from heat. In a widening circle, a shallow impression marked the lawn about 3 feet from the body, with a narrow instep, not the bride's. Beneath the gown were spotless. This heel had pressed down with weight. Poirot's eyes rose to the yew tree under which she lay. Its shadow spread long, faintly. Yew, an old, poisonous tree if one knew enough. The thorn, he thought, had been of another plant entirely. Of Helena, her tone poised but thin with strain. Monsieur Poirot. May I see her once more? He stepped. Lady Helena approached the body without a tremor in her step, though her gloved hands tightened and lingered not on her daughter's face, but on the small comb still pinned in sharp platinum and seed pearls. Was she holding anything when you found? Her eyes flicked toward him. No. Why do you ask? placed. One might think they were arranged after death. Lady Helena. Instead, she looked away toward the great windows of the drawing-room, where figures moved behind the his throat awkwardly. "We'll have to keep everyone here until Scotland Yard arrives, Lady Helena." "As you must." Poirot lingered a few minutes more in the garden. He examined the slender, tapering to a fine point, with a faint reddish-brown stain near the to him. It did not resemble the roses nearby. "Constable," Poirot, "if any plants have been moved recently in this garden, and also inquire, has..." The man scribbled the request and trotted off, clearly grateful for the direction. Conversation fell almost imperceptibly. A room of the wealthy and well-bred. He saw how Mrs. Margaret Draycott's hand, resting on the arm of Alexander's name was mentioned, how Hugh Kettering avoided meeting the groom's eye entirely. Smile returned a fraction too quickly when she caught Poirot's gaze. Alexander closed, but his cufflinks turned inward as though to hide them. "Monsieur Poirot, I appreciate your presence. The police, they will not see what is truly here. But it is what is not truly here that interests me more." The groom. Poirot looked toward the great French doors leading to the garden. "Meaning, monsieur, that grows in High-Weald Manor's grounds." Chapter 3. The great oak-panelled dining room of High-Weald Manor had been hastily transformed. After the champagne glasses had been carried away and the servants instructed to keep to the kitchen, the heavy of lilies from the floral arrangements meant for the wedding tables. The constable. No guest was to leave the premises until Scotland Yard arrived. He took up, though his eyes often strayed toward Poirot, who sat with a calm that seemed almost. One by one, the principal figures of the day were drawn into the light, not for salvation. Poirot, as ever, preferred to see his suspects in their natural state. Their behavior. Lady Helena Ferncliff sat near the head of the table, still immaculate despite the day's catastrophe. Her hands, resting on the polished, moved her hat, but not the pearl choker at her throat. Her eyes moved constantly from prove an ally and who a threat. A woman accustomed to control, she seemed determined. Beside her stood Miss Lydia Harcourt, the bride's cousin. A green silk dress whispered of both taste and money. She leaned against the back of a relative who has long been both indispensable and faintly resented. The impression of one who delighted in small advantages. Poirot noted that she was someone who considered herself better informed on marital matters than most wives. Groom kept himself apart from the others near the carved stone fireplace. When he answered the few murmured condolences, was steady, his manner contained. His hand, the ice long since melted. To Poirot, he seemed sheer will. Seated nearby was Mrs. Margaret Draycott, in black silk. It was, perhaps, an odd choice for a wedding, and of tears. Her gaze rested often on her son, as if this calamity only deepened some claim she felt over him. Mr. Hugh Kettering shifted restlessly in his chair, his stiff formality of the moment. He was a man whose jovial manner, one that had slipped notably since Charlotte's body had been found. The table, betraying impatience, perhaps anxiety. To the door. Near him sat Miss Emily Cartwright and one of her bridesmaids. She was pale, with tear-stained handkerchief as though it were an anchor in a storm, every with a look half of fear, half of appeal. It was that bound that gaze so tightly. And then there were a young man with the slightly pinched look of one more accustomed to deference, introduced earlier as a junior partner in Alexander's law firm. He appeared from the bride's family. His shoes were muddy, Poirot noted. Such a day, in such a house, mud was not an accident. At his throat, looking toward Poirot as though seeking permission. Slowly around the table. "My friends," he said gently. "Celebration, but for the somber work of truth. In circumstances that are, shall we say, highly unusual. Inquiries will be made by the police of Scotland Yard. Yet already most curious." A ripple passed among the guests. Resistance. Poirot's gaze moved from one face to another. Beneath the yew tree in the rose garden, she had in her hair, known to grow at High Weald Manor. There is the mark in the grass, the faint stain on the gown. Of all, there is no clear reason why she should have been there alone. Lady Helena's voice was the first to break the hush. "I imply nothing, madame," said Poirot smoothly. Such a gathering as this, we must all ask ourselves, who might have walked with her to that place? Such a Thorn. His words hung in the still air. Her head with a faint, knowing smile. And who says the Thorn? Perhaps it was in her hair from the morning. Charlotte always did favor. Poirot inclined his head. A possibility, yes. And with care, not to scratch the skin. This one was lodged. Across the table, Hugh Kettering cleared his throat too loudly. "Harmed her. You'll have to explain how. She looked peaceful enough." Poirot murmured, "Is sometimes the greatest disguise." Muttering about the Yard's impending arrival, Poirot nodded absently, the room, noting the tightening of a jaw here, the flick. In his mind, the chessboard was forming, and already he knew. At 8, there were those who knew precisely what had happened in the garden. Hercule Poirot had seen the first small cracks in their armor. Poirot takes the measure. The Manor's smaller morning. Poirot's quiet request. It was an airy chamber, with windows. Night, its pleasant proportions seemed diminished by the gravity of its purpose. It was lit against the creeping evening chill, though the heat did little to thaw the Poirot stood by the mantelpiece, his hands clasped neatly before him. curve of his shoes. The constable hovered at the doorway, ready to— Not, Poirot reflected, the questioning that mattered most at this stage. It was the set of the shoulders, the look in the eyes, the way the voice finds its pitch on Lady Helena Ferncliff. She entered without hesitation, her back perfect. She did not sit until invited, and when she did, she folded her hands atop the— "I wish to speak to each of us, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice a cool measure of— "Better the last hours of your daughter, madame." Her gaze did not falter. She was in excellent health. She was, if I may be frank, not— Charlotte was prepared for this marriage in every sense. Yet she left the gathering before— "Do you know why?" Lady Helena's eyes lowered briefly to her gloves. "No." She said nothing, as far as I'm aware. Poirot inclined his head. "You did not see her?" "Fractional, but present." "No." When she— As though such backward glances were for lesser mortals. Next was Lydia, that might have been mistaken for confidence. Her perfume lingered faintly in the room before she even— She began. "But I can't imagine how this Thorn business—" Yourself, Charlotte had a flair for the unusual. We all told her the comb in her hair today— Poirot regarded her over steepled fingers. "So you noticed the Thorn before she left the house?" "Too long." "No. Not exactly. But if it were— And you were in the drawing room all the time before the ceremony?" "Yes, of course. Well, as arrangements. He had put the wrong blooms in the vases in the east corridor, and I corrected them." And she flashed him a quick smile as though to assure herself she had charmed him. The groom came in without the stiffness of Lady Helena or the polish of Lydia, even, as though each movement cost him something. He did not meet Poirot's eyes at— He began, his voice low. "You must understand, I've no idea." Confirming some details. When I realized she was missing, I searched everywhere. She'd taken fright at the moment. "You found her yourself?" "Yes." Into fists. She was so still. I thought perhaps she'd fainted. Poirot waited. "You touched nothing?" I brushed her veil back." "So perfect even then, except for—" his voice— "The Thorn?" "Yes." He swallowed hard. "I have no idea." Poirot noted the groom's hands. Clean, but with the faintest trace of green. Next, she entered with the careful dignity of one who had prepared herself for an ordeal. "You've had a shock, madame," Poirot said softly. "I only met Charlotte a handful of times, but she was polite." A smile touched her lips. "My son could do better." But he seemed— The silence settle. "And you were aware when the cry went up that she was missing?" "I avoid large gatherings when I can." Her gaze did not waver. He asked, "And you never left the library at all?" "No." quick to speak, as though words could get him through unscathed. Terrible business, poor bit. She seemed fine when I saw her, cheerful even. You saw her shortly before she disappeared? Yes, just near the side gate. I was coming back from a stroll. A stroll before a wedding? I get restless indoors. Always have. She was alone, heading toward the garden. I thought she wanted a quiet moment. Didn't seem my place to interrupt. And you told no one of this? No. I suppose I should have. Miss Emily Cartwright's turn came. She sat with her handkerchief clutched tightly. She was nervous, Emily said softly. Not frightened. Charlotte wasn't the type. But she was thoughtful. I think something was troubling her. And you know what? Emily hesitated. She didn't say. But she asked me, quite out of the blue, if I believed in signs. I said no. She smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And you saw her after that? No. That was when she left the dressing room. Finally, Peter Kavanagh. He appeared the most ill at ease of them all. His voice was careful, measured. I hardly knew her, really. We met at the firm once or twice. And yet you were invited to the wedding. Alexander wanted me here. We've been working closely on a case. You were where when she disappeared? In the garden. I like gardens. I didn't see her, though. Yet your shoes, they are muddy, Poirot said mildly. Kavanagh's mouth tightened. I walked near the pond earlier. The ground is soft there. When he left, Poirot stood in the quiet room, the fire crackling softly. Already the small inconsistencies and the curious omissions formed a pattern, not yet complete, but suggestive. Somewhere among them was the truth of why Charlotte Ferncliff had walked into the garden and never returned, and Hercule Poirot intended to find it. Chapter 5. Whispers Beneath the Dome. The grand library of St. Augustine's Cathedral was not a place for idle gossip. Its air, tinged faintly with the scent of old vellum and candle smoke, demanded silence from those who entered. Yet that afternoon, the silence was a strained one, laced with the quiet rustle of robes and the soft, uneven tapping of footsteps on the stone floor. Miss Marple sat at one of the long, polished oak tables, a stack of archival boxes before her. The cathedral archivist, a stooped man named Mr. Havers, moved about in measured steps, bringing her each bundle with a care bordering on reverence. He had been surprisingly obliging when she expressed an interest in parish records and architectural drawings of the cathedral's renovations. Her knitting needles rested quietly beside her. She had brought them as a distraction, but for now, her eyes lingered on the faded ink of old maps and ledgers. There were notes here, scribbled in margins, that spoke of repairs made for the integrity of the dome and of hidden chambers best left undisturbed. What exactly is best left undisturbed in a cathedral? She asked quietly, her tone more reflective than inquisitive. Mr. Havers paused, his thin fingers tightening slightly on the box he was carrying. Old things, miss, old things that don't much care to be moved once settled. His voice was calm, yet there was an undercurrent of unease. This place has stood for centuries. Some of its stones remember more than they should. Miss Marple looked at him steadily, as if she were watching the wind bend a fragile reed. And you believe these stones remember more about Mrs. Dalrymple's death than is currently being spoken of? The man's mouth twitched, somewhere between a grimace and a reluctant smile. I wouldn't say that aloud, miss. Not in here. Before she could ask more, the library door creaked open, and Canon Forsyth entered. He moved briskly, his white clerical collar stark against the black of his cassock, his expression tightly composed. Miss Marple, I trust you are finding the materials you requested useful. I am indeed, she replied, with the warm politeness that made her sound perfectly harmless. though I must say, your cathedral has a history richer than one might expect." He gave a small, dismissive nod. "Age brings stories, and stories gather embellishments." His eyes drifted toward the table, noting the old floor plans she had uncovered. "Some of those are better kept as legends than investigated as facts." Miss Marple returned his gaze with an expression of serene agreement, even as her mind filed the remark away. She had learned long ago that people rarely warned you off a path unless they feared what you might find at its end. After the canon's departure, she continued reading. The ledgers spoke of a significant reconstruction in 1894, when sections beneath the south transept had been sealed off to prevent mischief. A few entries later, there was a note about removing dangerous items from public view. It was written in a hurried, almost anxious hand. She was still bent over the documents when she felt a shadow cross the table. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Lydia Prentice, one of the cathedral's volunteer docents. Lydia's pale face was framed by a hat far too elaborate for the season, its black veil falling in delicate mesh across her features. "You shouldn't be reading those," Lydia said in a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. "They only make you imagine terrible things." "Some terrible things, my dear, are worth imagining if one wishes to understand the truth," Miss Marple replied gently. Lydia leaned closer, lowering her voice further. "It wasn't just a fall, you know, Mrs. Dalrymple. People say she was pushed, and not from the stairway everyone thinks." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked quietly as she picked them up, as though the conversation were of no particular consequence. "Oh? And from where do they think she fell?" Lydia hesitated, glancing toward the far wall as though it might have ears. "From the dome gallery. There's a locked stairwell. Only certain people have the key. I've seen the canon go up there, and Mr. Havers too." Her lips pressed together, as if suddenly regretting the disclosure. "But I shouldn't say more." The woman retreated before Miss Marple could press further. Yet the remark hung in the air like the lingering scent of incense, suggestive, intangible, but impossible to ignore. She left the library an hour later, her basket in hand, her mind quietly turning over the conversation. The heavy stone corridors seemed to exhale cool air with each step she took. At one turn, she caught sight of Inspector Mallory speaking with two constables, his brows knit in a deep frown. He noticed her and approached. "Still investigating, Miss Marple." His tone was more resigned than irritated. "I merely observe," she replied. "Observation, after all, costs nothing, except perhaps the discomfort of those being observed." Mallory's frown deepened, but there was a glint of reluctant amusement in his eyes. "Just be careful. I've heard more than one person say the cathedral doesn't like to give up its secrets." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Fortunately, Inspector, I've always been rather good at coaxing secrets from reluctant company." As she stepped out into the grey afternoon light, the bells of St. Augustine's began to toll the hour. The sound rolled across the square like a warning, reverberating through stone and bone alike. And in the hollow echo that followed, Miss Marple could not help but think. Someone within those walls had killed Mrs. Dalrymple, and they were relying on the cathedral's long shadows to hide them. Chapter 6. The Whisper in the Parlour. The late afternoon sun had dipped low enough to paint St. Aldred's with a quiet, amber glow, as though even the day itself wished to step softly in the wake of the unsettling events of the night before. Inside the Thistle and Thorn, the old inn that had served as the village's unofficial gathering place for decades. Conversation was quieter than usual, though no less persistent. Miss Marple, seated in a corner armchair with her knitting bag beside her, allowed her needles to click gently, her eyes lowering from time to time as though the pearl stitches required her complete attention. In truth, she was listening, always listening to the soft undercurrent beneath the villagers' chatter. Mrs. Phelps, the innkeeper's wife, bustled about with an exaggerated briskness that Miss Marple recognized as a sure sign of discomfort. She passed the hearth where two older men nursed their ale. Their talk drifted over in disjointed fragments. Wasn't meant to be open, no business in there after all these years. She'd no right, but then you know how curious some folk are. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second before resuming. She suspected they were speaking of Miss Lydia Harcourt's unannounced visit to the old Camden house the previous week, a property long abandoned, yet rumoured to hold unpleasant secrets from the war years. Mr. Simons, the vicar's gardener, entered with his cap in his hands, looking sheepish. He caught sight of Miss Marple and nodded politely, though he did not approach. Instead, he bent his head toward Mrs. Phelps and spoke in a voice pitched low enough that the words did not carry, at least not to most ears. But Miss Marple had spent many years developing an ability to make sense of murmurs. Certain consonants, the hesitation between syllables, the slight upward inflection that denoted uncertainty. These could tell one more than a loud declaration. She caught only two distinct words, parlour and whisper. Her eyes travelled briefly to the wall clock, 5:10. The time would be perfect to wander toward the vicarage under the pretence of returning a borrowed book. She could not yet place the connection, but the word whisper in connection with the vicarage parlour stirred her instinct. As she gathered her things, a thin, pale figure entered through the side door. Miss Agnes Blythe, seamstress, quiet as a shadow, but with eyes that never missed a detail, gave a polite nod to no one in particular and slipped into a seat near the corner. Agnes was not the sort to enter a public place without reason. Miss Marple stopped by her table on the way out. "Good evening, Miss Blythe," she said with gentle cheer. "I do hope you've finished Mrs. Phelps' curtain repairs." Agnes blinked as though drawn from some private thought. "Oh, yes, only... well, it's nothing, really. But someone's been in the old vicarage parlour again." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was politely surprised, though she felt a flicker of excitement. "And how might you know that?" Agnes hesitated, twisting the strap of her handbag. "My cousin works for the vicar's sister, you see, and she says there was a draught, cold as January, coming from behind the bookcase. They say a whisper could be heard if you stood there long enough." She gave a small, uneasy laugh. "Superstition, I'm sure, but Mrs. Fenton swears she heard someone call her name." Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly on her knitting bag handle. "How very odd," she murmured. "One does wonder why drafts in this village so often come accompanied by peculiar sounds." She left the Thistle and Thorn and made her way along the path to the vicarage. The church bells chimed the quarter hour, their tones solemn. Reverend Baines himself answered her knock, looking rather distracted. "Ah, Miss Marple, what a pleasure," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Come in, though I must warn you, the parlour's in a dreadful state. My sister insists she heard something unusual there, and now I've half the villagers offering explanations." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple mildly, "you might indulge me in a brief look." The vicar agreed, though with a chuckle that suggested he expected her to find nothing. The parlour was dim, the curtains partly drawn. An old bookcase, heavy and dark, stood against the far wall. Miss Marple went straight to it, noting the faint displacement of dust along its edge. Someone had shifted it recently, if only slightly. Kneeling down, with some effort, for she was no longer young, she ran her hand along the floorboards. One, near the centre, felt faintly loose. She did not pry it open, such an act would be premature, but she noted the detail for later consideration. Standing again, she moved closer to the bookcase and stood still as Agnes had described. The room was silent, but for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. And then, very faint, almost lost to imagination, she heard it. A single word, drawn out as though spoken from a great distance. "Lydia." Miss Marple stepped back, her expression thoughtful. The voice could easily be the work of trickery, perhaps a concealed vent or an old communication pipe from another part of the house. But why Lydia Harcourt's name? And why now, when she had been so recently distressed? She turned to the vicar, who had been watching her curiously. "Most interesting," she said, her tone deliberately neutral. "Perhaps you might ensure no one enters this room without your presence, Reverend. I have a feeling it will bear upon matters we both would rather see resolved." As she took her leave, the low amber light had deepened to the dusky blue of early evening. She walked slowly back toward her cottage, turning over in her mind the threads now gathering. Lydia's visit to Camden House, the parlor whisper, the loosened floorboard, and the way the village seemed to hum with secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Somewhere in that quiet hum lay the shape of a motive, but it had not yet fully formed, and Miss Marple was patient enough to wait for the moment when it would. Chapter 8. The Lantern in the Fog. The night had grown heavier still, the fog now so thick that it seemed to press against the windows of the Hawthorn Inn, muting the glow from the lamps outside into pale, uncertain halos. Inside, the fire sputtered in the grate, sending shadows lurching across the low-beamed ceiling. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her knitting resting on her lap, her eyes, bright, thoughtful, and deceptively mild, fixed on the doorway. It opened slowly, as though weighed down by the cold mist beyond, and in stepped Inspector Graves. His coat was slick with dew, his hat pulled low. He glanced briefly about the room before making his way to her. "You were right," he said, removing his hat and taking the chair opposite. "Hollis did leave the lantern-lit bridge earlier than he claimed. There's a witness, an old bargeman who swears he saw him heading back toward the village well before the others left the bridge." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And did the bargeman happen to mention whether Hollis was alone?" Graves hesitated, then leaned in. "No. He says there was someone with him, a woman in a long, dark coat. Couldn't see her face. But she was smaller than Hollis, he thought, and she seemed to be carrying something." The fire crackled. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, though she did not lift them. "And did our bargeman note which way they went?" "Aye," Graves said grimly, toward the old mill. For a long moment, neither spoke. The old mill was abandoned now, its great wheels stilled, its timbers bowed and creaking with age. But the villagers still gave it a wide berth, half from superstition, half from the knowledge that its floors were treacherous, its staircases unsafe. "It is very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Hollis insists upon his innocence, yet more and more his movements become opaque." She gave Graves a small, knowing smile. "Opaque, Inspector, is rather a dangerous color in matters of truth." Graves snorted softly. "Aye, well, if I had my way, I'd have him in a cell tonight." "But that," Miss Marple said gently, "might only serve to drive the truth deeper into shadow. No, Inspector, I think it better to let the guilty believe they are still unseen, at least for the moment." Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters. A distant clang echoed faintly, the sound, perhaps, of the mill's broken metalwork catching the breeze. Graves glanced toward the sound, then back to her. "You think they might have hidden something there?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone carried a quiet weight. "I think, Inspector, that when a thing is stolen, not only a possession, but a life, it must be hidden somewhere the thief believes no one will dare to look. And the old mill—" She let the sentence trail off, but the implication hung in the air like the fog itself. Graves rose, fastening his coat. "Then I'll have men search it first thing in the morning." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "By morning, Inspector, it may be too late." The next hour found them making their way along the narrow lane toward the river. The fog thickened as they neared the water, wrapping them in a pale, muffled world where the hiss of the river against the banks was the only constant sound. The bridge loomed ahead, its lantern swaying faintly in the damp breeze, casting a sickly light over the wet boards. From here, the track to the old mill branched away, little more than a ribbon of mud through the reeds. Graves took the lead, his torch cutting a narrow path through the dark. Miss Marple followed, her steps unhurried, her expression calm. She had walked such paths before, in truth far more dangerous ones, but there was still something about the river fog that could unsettle even the most composed mind. The mill emerged from the mist suddenly, its looming silhouette half lost in the murk. The great wheels sagged lifeless, and the roofline seemed to tilt as though the whole structure were leaning toward the water. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly with each breath of wind. Graves motioned her back, but she merely stepped to the side, letting him push the door open fully. The smell inside was of damp wood and rust. His torch beam slid over rotting beams, the collapsed remains of old machinery, and the gaping mouth of the wheel shaft where the river once fed in. They moved cautiously through the lower floor, but nothing stirred. A set of narrow stairs climbed to the loft above. The inspector began to ascend, his boots careful on the warped boards. Halfway up, his torch beam caught something, an object tucked behind a beam at the top of the stairs. He reached for it, and Miss Marple, watching from below, saw his posture shift. It was a woman's glove. Not just any glove, but one with a faint pattern of embroidery at the cuff. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it for only a moment before she turned her gaze toward the dark corners of the loft above. Her mind quietly knitting the threads together. Somewhere in the night, the lantern on the bridge swayed again, its light briefly glinting off the damp glove in Graves' hand, and the fog seemed, at last, to grow heavier still. Chapter 9. A lantern in the dark. The air in the library was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. Outside, the wind pressed itself against the tall windows, rattling them faintly in their frames. Miss Marple remained seated in the high-backed armchair near the hearth, her knitting needles still in her lap, though she had not knitted a single stitch for the past quarter of an hour. Her eyes were fixed, not on the fire, but on the pale young man who stood by the farthest bookcase, running his hand along the spines as if looking for something only he could see. Julian Fairchild had been invited under the pretext of a quiet discussion. In truth, Miss Marple had maneuvered the encounter with the quiet precision of a chess player setting up the final stages of the game. He seemed restless, his movements quick, eyes darting occasionally toward the window as if worried someone might be watching from the grounds. "I find it so curious," Miss Marple began gently, her voice little more than a murmur, "how some books are never meant to be read, merely kept." Julian looked over at her, brow faintly furrowed. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Miss Marple." "Oh, I think you do," she replied mildly, her knitting needles clicking together at last. "Some volumes, Mr. Fairchild, exist purely to conceal what they contain, whether a secret family record, a pressed flower from a long-forgotten courtship, or something altogether more dangerous." For a moment, his gaze flickered, and she knew she had struck a chord. But before he could answer, the door creaked open. Inspector Crail entered, hat in hand, the soles of his boots sounding heavy on the carpet. "I've spoken with Mrs. Lorimer," he announced, moving to stand by the fire, "and it seems there are more discrepancies in people's accounts of that night than we first thought." Julian shifted his weight, a muscle working in his jaw. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying," Crail cut in. "I'm observing. And my observations tell me that someone entered the West Hall just after 9:30. Someone who had no business being there." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Julian's lips parted as if to speak, but Miss Marple interjected with the smallest lift of her hand. "Perhaps we should let the young man breathe, Inspector." We wouldn't wish to frighten away the truth by stamping our feet at it. Gentle questions, like gentle rain, can coax out the most stubborn seeds. Crail gave her a look that suggested both annoyance and grudging respect, then moved away toward the mantelpiece. Julian, however, seemed to relax. Not much, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. She set her knitting aside, leaned forward slightly, and asked in a tone almost conspiratorial, "When you went to the West Hall, was it before or after you saw the light in the attic window?" The effect was immediate. Julian's colour drained. I didn't. You see," Miss Marple went on, "light travels, Mr. Fairchild, and so do secrets. One only needs to be standing in the right place to see both." There was a long pause. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner filled the room like the slow beat of a heart. At last, Julian exhaled. "I was there. Someone who shouldn't have been. I heard footsteps." Crail asked sharply. Julian hesitated. It was Mrs. Lorimer. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Nothing away. She merely inclined her head and murmured, "And yet..." Drawing room. Julian swallowed hard, his fingers tight. "Then she's lying." The words seemed to hang in the air. Before either of them could respond, there was a faint knock at the door. Annie, the parlour maid, to poke her head in. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Says it's urgent." Miss Marple rose at once, her eyes sharp. A moment later, Gerald Redfern stepped into the library, his face drawn and pale. He carried something wrapped in brown paper. "I found this," he said, setting the parcel down. "In the tool shed by the south wall, hidden under a loose board." Immediately, untying the string. Inside was a small worn, the edges frayed. He opened it, scanning the first few. "What is it?" Julian asked. Crail looked up. Unreadable. Notes, detailed ones. Conversations, even what people were wearing. He turned the book toward Miss Marple, and it's signed. Marple took the notebook delicately, adjusting her spectacles as she turned. Neat, slanted handwriting was a name. She did not speak it. She closed the book and set it down with deliberate care. She said softly, "For this is no longer merely about a theft. This is about and planning." Julian's face had gone ashen. "Yeah?" Miss Marple's eyes, calm and unflinching. "Fairchild, still here, and perhaps nearer than you think." Sharply in the grate, sending a brief shower of sparks upward. Harder against the windows, as though trying to get in, and in the all of them that the old house itself was listening. Shadows between the walls. The evening drew in a shade of purple, as though the sky itself were holding its breath. Quietly in the small parlour of the inn, her knitting laid to one side. Restless crackle, but her mind was far from the comfort of its warmth. Back through the events of the past 2 days, faces, words. People did not think to hide. She could almost hear the hush of the dollhouse. Unnatural quiet it possessed. There was a secret lodged there. But in the pattern of the absences. Missing things, missing. Her reverie was broken by the arrival of Inspector Gray. him long before his voice did. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping effect and bafflement. "You've been speaking with quite a few of the locals today, I gather." "One learns much, Inspector, from listening to those who are only too eager to be overheard." Hands folded before him. "The trouble is, everyone's talking, and yet no one. And everyone's memories are curiously unreliable when it comes to the day of Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance." "Ah, but unreliability in memory, Inspector. Sometimes what people forget is the most important clue of all." "Great. I suppose you've seen something I've missed?" She gave him a sympathetic smile. "Nephew, I've seen enough, but one must not rush these matters. To truth, it is felt rather than simply collected like stamps." When the inn door swung open, letting in a gust of damp evening air, hushed from the cold. She hesitated upon seeing Miss Marple and Graves. "I thought I might find you here," she said, looking directly at Miss Marple. "What you asked me earlier, about the last time I visited the Hargreaves' house." "Miss—" "Yes, my dear. Have the mists cleared a little?" Nora glanced at Graves. "When I was in the parlor that day, I remember hearing a sound from behind the wall. Perhaps a box being slid along wood. I thought it was a mouse." The inspector frowned. "The one in the back parlor, just under the shelves where Mrs. Hargreaves kept her little keepsake." Marple leaned forward. "And tell me, did that wall connect to the part of the house where—" Furrowed in thought. "It would have been on the other side, yes." Miss Marple's knitting sat forgotten beside her. She asked in her most casual tone, "Aft, perhaps, or a smell of polish?" "Now that you mention it, nor like cedar, and I did feel a little cold breeze." Graves made a noise before. Nora looked defensive. "I thought it was just the old house settling." Hargreaves had gone away suddenly. "I didn't think—" Miss Marple lifted a hand. "My dear, it's in the nature of oddities to be ignored until they grow teeth. I'll have a constable examine the paneling first thing in the morning." Softly. "Tonight, while the village sleeps. Shadows can be most obliging." There was something in her tone that made Graves pause. He looked at her for a long moment. Later that night, the moon was pale, nearly swallowed by cloud, and the wind whispered through the hedgerows as though inside, the air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that listens. Moved towards the parlor wall Nora had described. Miss Marple stayed a few paces of keepsakes, tiny silver spoons, a pressed flower album, mostly softness. The inspector began tapping along the panel. For a while, it's thunk, a hollow note, faint but distinct. He crouched. "There's a seam here," he murmured. With a bit of coaxing, a section of dust-filled gap. The lantern's light barely reached the other end, but something glinted or the brass edge of a box. Nora shivered. It feels wrong. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. My dear, curiosity sometimes reveals more than we wish to see. Graves straightened. Miss Marple glanced toward the shadows behind him, her eyes thoughtful. Forget. The true question is not what is hidden, Inspector, but why it was hidden. The lantern flame wavered in the draught, and the three stood silent, the narrow gap before them. Chapter 7. Whispers through the parlor door. Pressed against the windows with a low, almost mournful hum, rattling the old panes in their the fire had died to embers, leaving the corners in shadow. Miss Marple moving, her gaze fixed, not on her work, but on the thin sliver of light behind it. Muffled voices rose and fell. They were too indistinct to catch every word, yet as though something had gone amiss. She glanced toward the others. Had abandoned her seat entirely and now stood by the mantelpiece, fussing with a small. However, seemed utterly still, save for the occasional tapping of his fingers against the arm of his chair. A sudden shift in the voices beyond the door made me. Someone, perhaps the housemaid, had spoken rapidly. The faint scrape of shoes on the wooden floor. Then the door draft and the figure of Mr. Latham, the Harcourt solicitor. Considering how much to say, his eyes flitted briefly to Miss Harcourt. There's been another matter, but edged. Best discussed privately. Mrs. Harcourt figure until her knuckles whitened. Not here, she. Morning room. The two left quickly, closing the door behind. Silence settled once more, broken only by the faint creak of the old. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her eyes remained thoughtful. Silence before addressing Inspector Graves without looking up. I dare. That was not about the weather. Graves gave a dry half smile. Miss Marple, but you'll forgive me if I don't comment just yet. Mildly, though her mind was already arranging the small pieces she. Scraps of overheard conversation, the peculiar glances exchanged. Curious absence of particular household members at key moments. And this time, it was the housemaid herself who entered, carrying avoiding everyone's gaze, but Miss Marple caught the girl's expression. Something else. Perhaps reluctance, as though she wished to be anywhere but. Miss Marple, ever gentle, said, "My dear, apron, quite pretty." The girl blinked, glancing. "Oh, yes, miss. It was my." Down the tea with hands that trembled slightly. "Begging your pardon, I ought to get back to the kitchen." But as she turned, a small folded scrap of paper slipped from her pocket to the carpet. "Allow me," Miss Marple said, bending with surprising swiftness to retrieve it. The maid's face drained of color as Miss Marple placed it in her hand. "Thank you, miss," the girl whispered, then hurried out. Graves was watching her go. "That girl's nerves are frayed," he muttered. Miss Marple nodded but said nothing. She had caught a single word scrawled on that paper before handing it back. It was not a name, but a place, and it was a place she knew, though it had no obvious connection to this house or this family. The sound of the wind rose again, and somewhere in the house a door slammed. Mrs. Harcourt had not yet returned, nor had Mr. Latham. The air in the parlour felt heavier now, as if the fire's dying glow could no longer hold back the shadows pressing in from the hall. Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely, her decision made. She rose, adjusted her cardigan, and with the air of a woman going to fetch another ball of wool, slipped quietly from the room. The hallway beyond was dim and lined with old portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her. From the direction of the morning room came faint, heated voices, Mrs. Harcourt's among them, and Mr. Latham's lower, more deliberate tones. But it was not toward them that Miss Marple went. Instead, she took the side passage toward the servants' wing, her soft steps making no sound on the worn runner. She knew that if there was truth to be found, it often lived in the corners of a house, where the voices of the overlooked carried freely. At the end of the passage, a half-open door revealed the faint clink of china and the hiss of the kettle. The maid was there, her back to the door, speaking in hushed tones to someone Miss Marple could not see. "But if they find out I told you, I'll be done for," the maid was saying. The other voice, male, unfamiliar, replied, "Then don't tell me here. Tonight after supper, same place." Miss Marple did not step forward. She withdrew silently, retreating to the shadow of the stairwell. When she returned to the parlour a few minutes later, Graves's sharp eyes were waiting. "Stretching your legs?" he asked. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied serenely, taking up her knitting once more. A little movement is good for one's circulation. But inwardly, her mind was already fixed on tonight after supper, when someone, somewhere in this house, intended to speak the truth. Chapter 11. Shadows at the garden gate. The evening air had taken on that particular chill which seemed to creep in uninvited through the hedges of Chisholm Manor. A thin mist clung to the lawns, softening the angles of the clipped yews and blurring the lantern glow from the terrace. Somewhere, deep within the grounds, an owl gave a single, solemn call before falling silent again. Miss Marple, though no stranger to night air, lingered at the edge of the gravel path as though listening to something inaudible to others. The events of the afternoon had left an unsettled texture to the household. Voices lowered, glances exchanged, the occasional abrupt disappearance of a servant through a side door. Colonel Swithers had been the first to seek her out after dinner. "You were right," he had said abruptly, his heavy brows drawn together. "About the gatehouse. Someone's been using it. Dust disturbed, papers left out, and a smell of tobacco, not the sort Jenkins smokes." His voice had carried an odd note, part accusation, part relief. "I'd wager someone's been slipping in under our noses." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and keen as frost, had rested on him without immediate comment. Now, hours later, she turned over his words as she stood by the low wrought iron gate that separated the rose garden from the east lawn. It was here, she recalled, that two of the guests had been seen speaking privately during the afternoon, speaking with an urgency they had not shown at dinner. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustle, a figure emerging from the laurel shadows, tall and thin, moving with the care of someone unaccustomed to darkness. It was Mr. Elric Havers, the solicitor's clerk who had arrived only that morning on an errand supposedly to do with estate paperwork. He started slightly when he saw her, then offered a smile that seemed to require an effort. "Ah, Miss Marple. Out for the air?" "Yes," she replied mildly. "And yourself? Though I should think your lodgings in the village might be more comfortable at this hour than wandering the gardens." Havers's hand went briefly to his breast pocket before he dropped it again. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "The mind gets tangled. I thought the walk might help." They spoke for a few minutes, but there was a strain in the air, as though each were waiting for the other to leave first. Finally, Havers gave a small nod and moved off toward the orchard, his figure soon swallowed by the mist. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the faint smell of tobacco, not the mellow pipe scent of the Colonel's brand, nor the cheap cigarette smoke from the footman, but something sharper, more foreign. By the time she returned indoors, the drawing-room had thinned. Only Mrs. Winifred Claiborne sat by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. She looked up at Miss Marple with eyes that seemed, for once, stripped of their usual self-possession. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked in a low voice. Miss Marple sat down. "Mr. Havers?" "Yes. Why?" Mrs. Claiborne hesitated, then glanced toward the door before speaking again. "He reminds me of someone. Someone I saw once, on a night very much like this. And if it's who I think—" She stopped, shivering, and bent to pick up her knitting again, as though regretting she had spoken at all. The old clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour. Miss Marple let the moment settle, then rose, smoothing her skirt. She would not press Mrs. Claiborne, not tonight. Some truths revealed themselves only when the hero was ready. But she made a mental note. The solicitor's clerk and Mrs. Claiborne's uncharacteristic unease were threads likely tied to the same knot. Later, as she prepared for bed, a faint tapping sound reached her from somewhere beyond the corridor, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like knuckles against wood. She opened her door slightly. The passage was empty, but down at the far end, near the staircase to the servants' wing, a narrow strip of light shone under a door. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. If the house wished to keep its secrets, it had chosen the wrong night. Chapter 12. Whispers beneath the rafters. The wind had risen by the time the evening fell over Stowrford, whistling through the eaves of the gabled houses and carrying with it the faint creak of weathered shutters. Inside the inn's lamplit parlour, the shadows moved restlessly along the panelled walls, seeming to lean closer to the living, eager for secrets. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner chair, the knitting in her lap lying forgotten for the moment. Her eyes, bright and deceptively mild, moved from face to face, listening as much to what was not said as to the words themselves. Reverend Clayworth had called a small meeting that night, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the upcoming parish charity fair, but in truth the air was thick with the unspoken topic. Everyone knew why they were there, and why they spoke in careful tones. Mrs. Fanshawe, who had taken the chair nearest the fire, folded her hands tightly over her skirt. "If I may say so," she began, her voice clipped, "this business of the crypt and the missing figure from the dollhouse has gone far enough. Stowrford's name is being sullied. And for what? Old gossip?" "No one's sullied anything, Mrs. Fanshawe," the vicar said gently, though his brow furrowed. "It's simply that certain matters have been brought to light, and they must be addressed." From his seat near the corner, Mr. Hugo Kent, the solicitor, gave a short laugh. "Addressed? What a charming euphemism. We've already had a police inspector nosing about the churchyard twice in a week, and a reporter from the Bristol Chronicle sniffing around yesterday. I expect by Monday we'll be entertaining ghost hunters." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her needles beginning to click again as if in absent thought. "Ghost hunters do rather prefer the convenience of the living supplying them with a good tale," she murmured, "and one might say that Stowrford at present is obliging them most generously." Mrs. Fanshawe gave her a sharp look. "Do you mean to suggest, Miss Marple, that some of our townspeople are inventing things?" "Oh, not inventing, no," said Miss Marple, her voice mild. "But sometimes it is easier to repeat a tale than to confront the rather more uncomfortable truth that may lie behind it. A vanished object, a rumour, a shadow in the rafters. All can become far more palatable when dressed in the clothes of mystery." It was then that Sergeant Barlow entered, stamping the damp from his boots. He looked unusually grave as he greeted the room. "I've come from the church. Reverend," he said, his voice low, "you'd best hear this." The group stilled, every gaze fastening upon him. The sergeant hesitated, then continued, "The constable doing the last sweep tonight heard something from the rafters above the chancel." "Birds," suggested Mrs. Fanshawe almost too quickly. Barlow shook his head. "Not birds. A sound like a person moving. Careful steps. We shone our lamps, but there was nothing to be seen. Only a small scrap of cloth caught on one of the beams." "A scrap of cloth?" the vicar repeated, his voice taut. Barlow nodded. "Dark wool, torn as if it had caught on something sharp. We'll send it for analysis, of course." Miss Marple's fingers did not falter in their steady motion, though her eyes were far away, as if tracing invisible threads between the present moment and some memory lodged deep in her mind. "A person moving quietly in the rafters of a locked church," she said softly. "One would have to be quite sure of their way, and quite sure no one would look up." Mr. Kent frowned. "If you're suggesting that someone has been, living in the church roof, Miss Marple, I dare say you've been reading too many penny thrillers." She gave him a pleasant smile. "Oh no, Mr. Kent. I leave penny thrillers to those with stronger nerves, but I have known cases where the most inconvenient things were hidden in the most inconvenient places, precisely because no one would think to search there." At this, Mrs. Fanshawe's hand went to her throat. "You mean the missing piece from the dollhouse?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, only setting her knitting aside and looking at the vicar. "I wonder, Reverend, whether you recall if there has ever been access to those rafters, perhaps a concealed ladder or trap used in older times?" Reverend Clayworth's frown deepened. "There was an access point in the north wall, dating back to when maintenance was done without scaffolding, but it's been boarded up for years." "Boarded up?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "That does make one think of how easily boards can be removed in silence." The conversation turned uneasy then, people speaking over one another, theories clashing. Mr. Kent insisted it was more likely a mischievous youth. Mrs. Fanshawe muttered about vagrants. The vicar worried aloud about the sanctity of the building being violated. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quiet, her eyes half-lidded, as if sifting each word for hidden weight. When the meeting broke up, she lingered behind, ostensibly to retrieve a dropped ball of yarn. The others filed out into the damp night, voices muffled in the fog that had begun to creep over the square. Barlow came to stand beside her. "You've got that look, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "The one that says you've put something together." "Oh, I wouldn't say put together," she replied, winding the yarn neatly. "But it does occur to me that certain pieces, no matter how cleverly hidden, will always betray themselves to the patient observer, even if they are tucked away above the heads of the whole parish." Barlow studied her a moment. "And you think whoever's been up there might still be here, in Stowford?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but her eyes were steady. "Oh, Sergeant, I should think they've never truly left." Outside, the fog swallowed her figure as she stepped into the square, the lamplight painting a soft halo around her hat. Above the church, unseen in the drifting mist, the rafters waited, silent but not empty. Chapter 13. The Shadow in the Photograph. The rain had returned by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Cray arrived back at the vicarage. It drummed against the windows in long, steady streams, pooling in the flower beds and washing over the gravel paths. Inside, the lamps cast pools of gold light on the walls, but the air felt heavy, not just with the damp, but with the residue of too many unspoken things. Miss Marple sat at the small table near the window, a cup of tea cooling beside her, while Inspector Cray laid out the evidence they had gathered that day. Most of it was mundane, notes on witness statements, a partial timetable, and a collection of photographs from the garden party 2 weeks ago. "It's curious," Cray muttered, flicking through the glossy prints. "Everyone insists that the quarrel between Mrs. Denholm and Mr. Chiswick was nothing. Yet in each account, they take care to mention it." He tapped the edge of one photo. "This one was taken perhaps 5 minutes before the quarrel. Nothing in it suggests any tension." Miss Marple leaned forward, her pale eyes scanning the frozen scene. Mrs. Denholm laughing, her gloved hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. Mr. Chiswick mid-conversation with Reverend Lyle. The background showed the hedge arch and the tea table, and, just at the far edge, a faint blur. The kind that comes from movement just as the shutter clicks. "May I?" she asked gently. He handed it over. She studied the blur, her mind working in its quiet, deliberate way. It was not the blur of a passing bird or the flutter of a curtain. The shape was too vertical, too sharply outlined on one side. "Who took this photograph?" she asked. "Mrs. Pelling. Amateur, but her husband tells me she's quite devoted to documenting every village occasion." Miss Marple gave a small hum. One might say that such devotion often captures more than one intends. Cray raised an eyebrow. "You think there's something important in that shadow?" She smiled faintly. "I think it might not be a shadow at all." Before Cray could respond, the front door creaked open and Reverend Lyle entered, his umbrella dripping. He removed his hat with a harried air. "Ah, Miss Marple, Inspector. I came straight away. I have just remembered something. It may be nothing, but—" He hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "At the garden party, just after Mrs. Denholm's quarrel with Mr. Chiswick, I saw her speaking rather urgently with Miss Clara Pelling." Cray frowned. "The same Clara Pelling who took the photograph?" "Yes. It struck me because Mrs. Denholm looked rather flushed, and Miss Pelling, well, she seemed unusually evasive afterward. I only mention it because of your interest in that day." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Did you hear any part of their conversation?" "Only the end. Mrs. Denholm said something about not letting it fall into the wrong hands. I assumed it was some personal trifle. A brooch, perhaps? Or a letter?" Cray made a note, but Miss Marple was still holding the photograph, her thoughts quietly arranging themselves like pieces in a sewing pattern. "Inspector," she said at last, "would you be so kind as to arrange for me to speak with Miss Pelling tomorrow? And perhaps it would be wise to ask if she still has the negatives of these photographs." Cray gave her a long look. "Negatives? That's a rather specific request." Miss Marple sipped her now lukewarm tea. "One learns," she said mildly, "that in certain matters, what is removed can be more telling than what remains." The Reverend, still standing with his hat in his hands, looked between them. "Do you mean, you think this has to do with the murder?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She merely smiled, a faint, knowing curve of the lips that did not quite reach her eyes. Outside, the rain thickened, turning the garden paths into small rivers. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled the hour, deep and resonant, as though marking not just the passage of time, but the slow turning of some unseen wheel. That night, Miss Marple sat long at her writing desk, the photograph beside her lamp. She studied it again and again, her mind tracing over every inch of the image, every face, every fold of clothing, every shadow. Somewhere in that glossy rectangle, she felt certain, lay a fragment of truth, the sort of truth that once noticed could not be ignored. When she finally set it down, her thoughts had already leapt ahead to the next morning, and to the quiet parlour of Miss Clara Pelling, where the air, she suspected, would be thick with both the scent of lavender polish and the careful concealment of something far less innocent. Chapter 14. The note in the mirror frame. The following morning was brighter than any Miss Marple had yet seen during her stay at Greystone Hall, yet its golden light seemed to strike upon a house still weighted with the previous night's shadow. The guests gathered in the breakfast room were subdued, though they made small efforts at cheerfulness. A polite word here, a half-hearted comment there. Only the faint clinking of china broke the silence. Miss Marple entered quietly, her knitting bag tucked neatly under one arm, and took a seat at the far end of the table. She appeared to be occupied with selecting a slice of toast, but her pale eyes roamed from face to face, noting who avoided whose gaze, who seemed restless, and who appeared just a little too composed. It was Mr. Harcourt who at last broke the quiet. "Inspector Graves will be back this afternoon," he announced, though his tone implied that the fact was neither welcome nor avoidable. "He intends to clarify certain matters." Lady Trevelyan, seated stiffly at the head of the table, inclined her head. "Quite right. Matters of this nature must be resolved promptly." She spoke as though a theft and a murder were merely administrative inconveniences to be tidied away. Miss Marple spread marmalade delicately on her toast. "I am sure he will be thorough," she said mildly, "though one wonders whether new evidence might come to light before then." Her remark drew a sharp glance from Mr. Harcourt, as though he feared she knew more than she ought. After breakfast, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered, apparently aimlessly, through the upper corridor. She paused at the door of the late Miss Elspeth Harcourt's bedroom, left untouched since her sudden death 2 months earlier. Though officially ruled a natural passing, Miss Marple had long suspected otherwise. The air in the room was faintly stale, the curtains drawn against the morning sun. She examined the dressing table, the neat arrangement of combs and bottles. Then her attention fell upon the gilt-framed mirror above it. Something about its position seemed altered. She stepped closer. The mirror's frame was deep, almost a shadow box, and a narrow slip of paper protruded ever so slightly from one corner. Taking care not to disturb the dust, Miss Marple eased it free. It was folded in two, yellowed slightly with age. In a spidery, hurried hand, the note read, "If anything happens to me, it was not accident. Watch the one who smiles when no one else does." Miss Marple read it twice, her mind turning over the implications. She replaced it in the frame exactly as she had found it. This was not the moment for premature revelations, and withdrew from the room, her expression one of mild distraction to any who might have passed her in the hall. Later, in the drawing room, she found herself seated beside Eleanor Price, the quiet, self-contained young woman who had been in the house the night Miss Harcourt died. Eleanor's dark eyes flicked towards Miss Marple, then away again. "Such a lovely day," Miss Marple observed softly. "And yet the house feels weighed down, don't you think?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "It's not the same since she went," she murmured. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "One hears it said," she remarked, "that in times of tragedy, certain expressions can betray far more than words. I once knew a young man who smiled when no one else did, and it turned out to be quite telling." Eleanor's hand tightened on her teacup. "Smiles can mean many things," she said quickly, then stood as though remembering an errand. When she had gone, Miss Marple's gaze drifted towards the tall windows. The garden beyond was ablaze with dahlias, yet her thoughts were fixed upon the cold, cramped space behind a gilt mirror, and the knowledge that Inspector Graves must hear of it. But at precisely the right moment. For in this house, she was increasingly certain, the truth was not hidden by lack of evidence, but by the precise arrangement of appearances. Appearances that would need to be disturbed very, very carefully. Chapter 15. The Visit to the Lantern Maker. The early afternoon sun cast long, slanted beams through the narrow lanes of the old quarter, where shadows clung to doorways, and the air smelled faintly of oil, dust, and smoke. Poirot walked at an unhurried pace, his polished shoes making small, deliberate clicks upon the uneven cobblestones. I followed closely, noting the deep calm in his demeanor, though his eyes, sharp and restless, flitted from one detail to another with unwavering attention. Our destination was a small, half-forgotten workshop squeezed between a shuttered tea-house and a crumbling stone archway. Above the door, hanging from a crooked iron bracket, was a single lantern of intricate brasswork, its panels of green and amber glass casting jewel-toned shadows on the wall. Inside, the air was warm and tinged with the smell of lacquer. Rows upon rows of lanterns hung from the ceiling, their glass catching the light in fractured rainbows. Some were delicate as a spider's web. Others were heavy, the sort one might expect to see swaying above a bridge on a foggy night. A man emerged from behind the counter. His frame was slight, his hair silver, his eyes watery yet watchful. He wore a brown work apron, and his hands were mottled with old burns and flecks of dried paint. "Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice low, carrying a hint of suspicion. "Oui, monsieur," Poirot replied, inclining his head with that immaculate courtesy which disarmed even the most wary of strangers. "It is most kind of you to receive us without notice." The man's gaze shifted to me, then back to Poirot. "You said it was about the commission. The one for the bridge?" Poirot stepped lightly toward a row of lanterns. "Indeed. You made them, did you not?" "The set of 12 that were to adorn the lantern-lit bridge during the festival 2 months ago." The lantern maker nodded. "That's right. Special order. Brass frames, green and amber glass. But they never made it to the bridge. Half were stolen before delivery." "Half, you say?" Poirot turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. 6 lanterns gone, yet 6 remained." "Yes. The ones that weren't taken were delivered and later installed. But after the incident, they were removed. No one wanted them on display. Bad luck, they said." I noted the faint tremor in the man's hands as he spoke. Poirot moved closer to the counter. "And the missing 6? Were they identical to those recovered?" The lantern maker hesitated, then nodded. "Same design, same materials. Only the stolen ones, they were slightly heavier. You wouldn't notice unless you handled them side by side." Poirot's expression altered by the smallest fraction, the sort of change I'd come to recognize as the spark of a new idea. "Heavier?" Poirot asked softly. "By how much, do you think?" "Perhaps a pound more, maybe 2. I assumed it was due to imperfections in the brass, but—" The man trailed off, looking troubled. "It didn't occur to me then to question it." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and began a slow circuit of the shop. "And monsieur, who placed the order for these lanterns?" The lantern maker's eyes shifted toward the floor. "A woman, well-dressed, spoke with confidence. She paid in full, in cash. Never gave her name, only instructions. Said the lanterns must be ready by the day before the festival, without delay." Poirot stopped before a lantern whose glass shimmered like captured sunlight. "You recall her appearance?" The man frowned in concentration. Mid-30s, perhaps. Dark hair, worn up, a scar, faint but there, along the jawline. And she wore gloves. Even indoors, she never removed them. I glanced at Poirot, noting the stillness in his frame, the way his head tilted slightly to one side. "And after the theft," Poirot continued, "did she return? Did she inquire?" "No," the lantern maker said firmly. "Never saw her again, but—" He hesitated. "A week later, a boy brought me a small envelope. Inside was a single brass fitting, part of one of the stolen lanterns. No note, no message, just that piece of metal." Poirot's eyes lit briefly with interest. "And what became of it?" "I kept it," the man replied. He moved to a drawer beneath the counter and drew out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a brass fitting, worn and slightly dented. Poirot took it delicately, weighing it in his palm. "Curious," he murmured. "This is not ordinary brass. It is lined within, perhaps to hide something. See here, Hastings. The seam is too fine to be merely decorative." I leaned closer, catching the glint of a narrow, almost invisible groove along the inner curve. Poirot handed the fitting back with a small bow. "Monsieur, you have been most helpful. But one more thing. Did you speak of this heaviness or the missing lanterns to anyone beyond the local authorities? The man shook his head. No. Who would I tell? Poirot smiled faintly. Sometimes, monsieur. The one person you tell is exactly the wrong person, but in this case, I believe you have exercised admirable restraint. As we stepped back into the street, the late afternoon light seemed to have taken on a sharper edge. Poirot's stride was brisk now, his mind clearly absorbed in a fresh tangle of deductions. Hastings, mon ami, he said without turning, our case is not about lanterns at all. It is about what they were built to conceal, and if my little grey cells are not mistaken, the person who ordered them is far closer to our current circle than anyone realizes. I felt a chill creep along my spine. You mean, I began. Patience, Poirot interrupted, his voice firm but almost amused. All will become clear, but first we must pay a call to someone who has been very careful to appear unimportant. We walked on in silence, the shadows lengthening ahead of us, as though the very streets themselves were drawing us toward the next revelation. Chapter 16. The Lantern at the Garden Wall. The night was deepening when Poirot and Hastings made their way back to the manor. The earlier drizzle had become a steady, cold mist, wrapping the gardens in a pearly haze. Beneath the dim, golden gleam of the estate's lamps, the air smelled faintly of wet earth and roses, though the flowers were long past their season. Poirot walked with his hands clasped neatly behind his back, his gaze sweeping left and right, as though the garden itself might whisper its secrets if one only looked at the proper angle. You will observe, mon ami, he said quietly, that certain things are most enlightening not when they are displayed, but when they are absent. It is the void, the space, the missing piece, always that, which tells the true story. Hastings frowned. You mean in this case? Shh. Poirot slowed near the far stone wall, where a single lantern cast a trembling light over ivy-covered masonry. Tell me, Hastings, do you recall if this lantern was lit when we arrived earlier this evening? Hastings hesitated. Well, now that you mention it, I don't think so. But the storm had only just begun then. Perhaps someone lit it afterward. Perhaps, Poirot murmured. He stepped closer, peering at the lantern. But it is old, yes? And the oil reservoir. It is nearly empty. This is not a lantern meant for everyday use. It is lit for a purpose. A signal, perhaps. I opened my mouth to question him further, but Poirot was already crouching, his sharp eyes examining the damp grass beneath the wall. 2 sets of footprints, he announced softly. One heavier, a man. The other, much lighter, but they walked close together. Ah, mais oui, they walked in step as though familiar. And they stop here, Hastings noted, peering at the wall. Why? They couldn't have climbed it. It's nearly 8 feet high. Couldn't they? Poirot replied, running his fingers over a section of the stonework. See here, the ivy is torn, and there is a smudge of fresh soil upon the coping. The mist seemed to cling tighter around us, muffling the sounds from the house. Poirot's voice dropped lower. If I am not mistaken, Hastings, this wall has been both the boundary and the bridge between 2 worlds tonight. One person left, another arrived, and the lantern was the sign that it was safe. I shivered slightly, not entirely from the cold. But for what? A meeting? An exchange? Poirot straightened, glancing toward the dark shapes of the yew trees. We shall know soon. I think we have here a clue that connects to both the missing document and the curious changes in the household these past 3 days. But we must not alert our quarry too soon. Let them think they are safe. We walked on, circling back toward the side entrance of the manor. As we approached, the sound of raised voices drifted from within. It was Miss Celandine's sharp, fluting tone met by a lower, angrier male reply. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and he quickened his pace. Inside, in the great hall, Miss Celandine stood rigid as a carved figure, her eyes blazing. Opposite her was Rupert Galloway, flushed and clearly furious. Between them, Lady Westerly hovered, pale and tight-lipped. "And I tell you," Miss Celandine was saying, "if you persist in this ridiculous scheme, you will ruin not only yourself, but everyone in this house." "And I tell you," Galloway shot back, "that you've meddled in matters you can't possibly understand." "Messieurs et mesdames," Poirot interjected smoothly, stepping forward with Hastings close behind. "You speak of schemes, of matters not to be understood, but perhaps, if we were all to sit down calmly, some light might be shed." Both combatants glared at him, though Lady Westerly looked almost relieved. "Mr. Poirot, these family disputes," she began, "are sometimes the very heart of the matter," Poirot finished gently. He turned toward Galloway. "Monsieur, perhaps you would accompany me to the library. There we might speak without the, how shall we say, accompaniment of an audience." After a pause, Galloway gave a stiff nod. "Fine, but only because I've had enough of the theatrics for one evening." In the library, the fire was low but warm. Poirot motioned for Galloway to sit, then took the armchair opposite, leaning forward slightly. "You have been under much strain, I think. Financial difficulties, perhaps?" Galloway's jaw tightened. "That's none of your concern." "Ah, but it is, you see. Because it is connected. Yes, I believe so. To why the lantern burns at the garden wall, and why someone has taken the trouble to arrange meetings in the mist and darkness." The man's eyes flickered briefly, betraying something, a crack in his otherwise guarded manner. "You've been snooping," he said at last. "I have been observing," Poirot corrected. "And I observe that when one man is desperate, he becomes willing to take risks. Even risks that might endanger those who trust him." Galloway pushed back his chair, restless. "If you know so much, then you also know I'm not the only one involved." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Non, monsieur, that I know very well." The room fell silent except for the faint hiss of the fire. Then, without another word, Galloway turned on his heel and strode out, leaving Poirot seated, fingers steepled, eyes glinting with thought. "Hastings," he said quietly once we were alone, "the pieces are aligning, but we must tread with the greatest delicacy. One false step, and the quarry bolts. And then—" He broke off, glancing toward the curtained window, where beyond the glass the mist still coiled about the lantern-lit wall. "And then, my friend, we would lose them entirely." Chapter 16. The Thread in the Shadows. The late afternoon sun, pale and thin, streamed through the high windows of the village hall, casting long, slanted bars of light across the polished wood floor. Miss Marple sat near the back, her knitting bag resting on her lap. The rhythmic clack of her needles was the only sound in the stillness, though her eyes were far from fixed on the growing length of pale blue wool. She was, as ever, watching. The small meeting had been called ostensibly to discuss the arrangements for the church fete, but it had drawn in a rather curious assembly. Mrs. Felton had taken her seat with an air of brisk efficiency, her gloves still on. Dr. Coulson lingered near the window, looking as though he might prefer to be anywhere else. And Mr. Everley, who had lately been behaving as though each step upon the village green might conceal a trap door, sat stiffly at the far end, his hat clenched in both hands. Miss Marple observed them all quietly. It was not the fate that interested her, of course, but the curious tangle of unease that seemed to have settled over St. Anselm's in the wake of Mr. Pritchard's untimely death. There were whispers now, about money, about certain late-night walks, about the arguments that had not been as private as their participants believed. She let the conversation about bunting and cake stalls wash over her, only half heard. Instead, she took note of small things. The way Mrs. Felton avoided looking at Dr. Coulson when the matter of fundraising came up. The way Mr. Everley's eyes darted towards the door each time it creaked open. The quick, almost imperceptible stiffening of Reverend Hale when Mrs. Atwood mentioned certain items still missing from the vestry. When the meeting concluded and the scraping of chairs filled the room, Miss Marple rose slowly, slipping her knitting away. She allowed herself to be caught in the small tide of departing villagers, yet deliberately found herself beside Mrs. Felton as they stepped out into the cool air. "You seem rather thoughtful, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Felton adjusted her hat. "Do I? I suppose it's all this business. It's dreadful, simply dreadful. I do think the police ought to do more." "They do what they can," Miss Marple murmured, "though sometimes they require a nudge." Mrs. Felton gave her a quick, wary glance, but said nothing. They parted at the corner, and Miss Marple, instead of heading home, took the narrow lane that skirted the back of the churchyard. She had learned long ago that the most useful truths often lay in the small, unattended spaces of a village. Near the lych gate, she paused, her attention caught by a flash of movement. A slim figure was crossing the path from the rectory garden to the vestry door. Young Sarah Blake, the organist's daughter. She was holding something close to her chest, wrapped in a brown cloth. When she saw Miss Marple, she startled, then attempted a bright smile. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, a little too quickly. "Good afternoon, my dear. Such a fine day to be about one's errands." Sarah mumbled something about helping her father and slipped inside the vestry. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, her eyes on the door. Then, with a small sigh, she continued along the path. There was no need to follow. Not yet. Instead, she took tea at her cottage, allowing her mind to wander over the pieces she had gathered. Mr. Pritchard's death had seemed at first a matter of sudden misfortune, but it had since developed corners, as she often thought of it, sharp little edges that pricked the fingers when one tried to grasp the truth. That evening, there was another development. A note slipped under her door without knock or greeting. The handwriting was cramped, the paper plain. "Ask the doctor about the ledger, but be careful. Not everyone will let you read it." Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it neatly upon her writing desk. A ledger, and the doctor. The possibilities were intriguing. She did not act immediately. Instead, she called upon Dr. Coulson the next morning under the perfectly reasonable pretext of inquiring after her neighbor's rheumatism. The doctor received her in his small surgery, his manner brisk but courteous. Yet when she casually mentioned having heard of certain unusual accounts being kept in the parish, his reaction was telling, a slight tightening about the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. "I keep my patients' records strictly confidential, Miss Marple," he said, "as I must." "Of course, dear doctor, though I was thinking of financial ledgers rather than medical ones. Such things are often so dull unless they are unexpected." Dr. Coulson smiled thinly. "I wouldn't know." But she thought he did know, and that knowledge, coupled with the mysterious note, suggested that the matter of the ledger might well prove central to the whole business. That afternoon, she made another quiet circuit of the village, speaking to no one of consequence, yet gathering impressions as one gathers wildflowers in a meadow. By the time she returned to her cottage, a faint but steady thread had begun to form in her mind, one that might, if followed carefully, lead straight to the heart of the shadows that had fallen over St. Anselm's. Miss Marple, as she set her knitting aside for the night, could not help but smile faintly. People so often assumed that danger came only with noise and force, but she knew better. The most dangerous things were often the quietest, and somewhere in that quiet, she thought, the truth was waiting. Chapter 17. Shadows in the Hallway. The narrow corridor of the manor seemed longer that night than it had in daylight, stretching into darkness as if the house itself had grown wary of its own secrets. A faint scent of furniture polish and something older, dust perhaps, or disuse, lingered in the air. Somewhere far off, The wind rattled a loose window latch, creating an intermittent, irregular tapping that almost resembled footsteps trailing just out of sight. Miss Marple moved quietly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the carpet runner. She held a candle lamp rather than rely on the sconces. Their electrical wiring had been known to flicker at inconvenient moments, and she had no desire to be plunged into sudden darkness while pursuing a thought. Ahead, the hall curved slightly, leading toward the guest wing where she knew one door had remained locked since the night of the incident. Her earlier conversation with Inspector Graves had left her with a nagging notion. One detail in the timeline that simply did not fit unless that door concealed something more than old trunks and moth-eaten curtains. As she neared it, she paused. A thin draught whispered beneath the threshold, carrying with it a faint odor she could not immediately place. Not unpleasant, but entirely foreign to the rest of the manor's scent. She lowered the lamp and studied the floor. The dust along the skirting board was undisturbed, yet the thin line directly under the door was broken, as though brushed aside by something passing recently. Miss Marple's eyes softened with that faraway look she so often adopted when piecing together some invisible puzzle. But before she could dwell further, a faint creak sounded behind her. She turned sharply. At the far end of the hall, a shadow detached itself from the darker recess near the stairwell. It was only when the figure stepped into the lamplight that she recognized Mr. Alden, the estate's long-time steward. His lined face bore an expression of polite surprise, though his eyes were quick, alert, perhaps a shade too alert. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice calm, "you startled me. Walking the halls at this hour?" She smiled in that mild, almost apologetic way that tended to put people off their guard. "I find it's often the only time one can have a true look at a place. The absence of movement. It can reveal more than the bustle of the day." His gaze flicked briefly to the locked door. "That room hasn't been touched in years. Best left shut." "Indeed," she murmured, as though accepting the statement without question. But her hand, resting lightly against the door frame, had felt the faintest tremor in the wood, a sign that something within was not entirely still. Mr. Alden cleared his throat. "The family prefers it remain that way. I'd suggest you do the same, madam." "Sound advice, no doubt," she said with a serene nod. "Well then, I shan't trouble it." And with that, she turned back toward the main landing, letting him watch her go. She could feel his eyes on her until she rounded the corner. Back in her room, Miss Marple closed the door softly and sat down at the small writing desk. She opened her notebook and drew 2 neat columns. One marked "What is known," the other "What is suspected." In the first, she wrote, "Locked guest room, no entry since incident." In the second, "Footsteps heard, dust disturbed, odor unfamiliar." Below this, she added a third line, "Mr. Alden's watchfulness." She tapped the pencil against her chin. The odor had bothered her, a faint herbal quality, almost medicinal but with a trace of something sharp. It reminded her of a tonic once favored by a retired colonel she had known in St. Mary Mead, used for sleeplessness. The question was, why would such a scent be wafting from a locked, unused room? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound outside her window, the crunch of gravel under a cautious foot. She rose quickly and moved to the curtains, easing them aside just enough to peer down into the courtyard. A figure was crossing it, hunched and swift, heading not toward the gates but toward the side garden, where the path curved out of sight behind the hedge. The moon caught the glint of something metallic in the person's hand. Miss Marple let the curtain fall back into place. The manor's secrets, it seemed, were unwilling to wait until morning. She sat once more, adding a final note. "Tonight, something will move." And with that, she reached for her cardigan and prepared to step quietly into the hall again. Chapter 18. The puzzle completed. The drawing room of the Darnley estate seemed quieter than it had been in weeks. A pale winter light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Everyone was gathered, faces tight, shoulders rigid, as though bracing for the blow they knew must come. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her knitting needles resting on her lap, unused. She looked almost grandmotherly, the kind of figure one might expect to read stories to children rather than deliver the unmasking of a criminal. But her eyes, sharp, unwavering, were fixed on the group with an intensity that gave no comfort. "I believe," she began in her calm, almost conversational tone, "that we may now set aside any remaining doubts. We know who killed Sir Bertram and why, but perhaps it would be kind to explain how we arrived here, since deceit, like knitting, can be best understood when one carefully unpicks the tangled threads." Lady Helena, pale and wan, clutched her shawl tighter. Julian Darnley's jaw worked as though he wished to speak, but feared what might follow. Margot Fenton leaned against the mantelpiece, feigning nonchalance. Reverend Prowse sat stiffly, hands folded in prayer or perhaps in restraint. And in the far corner, Inspector Cray looked like a man waiting for the trigger of a trap to snap shut. Miss Marple smiled faintly. At first it all appeared so simple, a burglary gone wrong. The missing papers from Sir Bertram's study seemed to confirm it. But there was one small thing I could not reconcile. Sir Bertram was a man of meticulous habits. He kept his study locked at all times. Only those with keys could have entered without leaving signs of force. That narrowed our field considerably. She paused, glancing meaningfully at Julian. "You, Mr. Darnley, claim to have been away at the time, yet the stable boy recalled seeing you cross the grounds on the very night of the murder. A harmless oversight, perhaps, but the sort of detail the guilty seldom notice others observing." Julian's knuckles whitened against the arm of his chair. "But you are not alone in attracting my attention," Miss Marple continued. "Miss Fenton's curious interest in the old map cabinet told me she knew far more about the missing documents than she admitted. And Reverend Prowse, your sudden concern for Lady Helena's safety, your rather selective recollection of the evening's events, suggested a knowledge you ought not to have had." Margot gave a short, nervous laugh. "You make it sound like we're all murderers, Miss Marple." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said gently. "Only one of you committed murder. But several of you wove a web of lies to protect your own secrets. For instance, the missing papers. Those were not the reason Sir Bertram was killed, but rather the means to conceal the true motive." She set down her knitting needles. The room seemed to draw tighter around her. Sir Bertram had recently discovered an old scandal, one that, if made public, would have ruined a reputation quite dear to someone here. A certain financial misappropriation in the trust fund Lady Helena's late father had established. Sir Bertram, being an honourable man, intended to confront the person quietly, but that person chose another course. Lady Helena's breath caught audibly. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You went to his study that evening, Lady Helena. I believe you meant only to persuade him to keep the matter between you, but when he refused, when he made it plain that restitution must be made and the truth told, you struck him with the paperweight that lay upon his desk." Helena's lips trembled. No, I—" She looked desperately toward Julian, then Margot, as though for rescue. None came. "I dare say it was not premeditated," Miss Marple said gently. "But afterwards you saw the opportunity to remove the incriminating papers and make it appear as though the crime had been committed by a thief. You told no one, of course, save perhaps Julian, who has been trying ever since to shield you from suspicion, and Margot, who stumbled upon the truth and sought to use it for her own advantage." Margot's expression hardened, but she said nothing. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. "Lady Helena, is this true?" Helena's eyes filled with tears. "He wouldn't listen. He was going to tell everyone. My father's name, our family." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple rose, her frail figure seeming almost sorrowful. The tragedy, Inspector, is that Sir Bertram, for all his sternness, would have done everything in his power to keep her from disgrace, but the fear of scandal has led many down darker roads than this. Cray stepped forward, his expression grim. Lady Helena Darnley, I must ask you to come with me. As he led her away, Julian followed helplessly, his voice low but urgent, trying to offer comfort she could not hear. The drawing-room emptied slowly, leaving Miss Marple alone. She resumed her knitting, her hands moving with steady precision. Outside, the pale winter sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the estate. Another knot of human folly had been untangled, though the cost was one more life shattered. For Miss Marple, there was no triumph in such endings, only the quiet satisfaction of truth brought to light, and the knowledge that, somewhere in the delicate weave of human hearts, a little more darkness had been cleared away.